He drove her home. He waited until she was safely inside. He watched the door close behind her. And then he drove away, not knowing that what he had just done, a completely ordinary act of kindness for his mother-in-law, was about to make him the most publicly accused innocent man in one of the highest-profile missing persons cases in the country. Tommaso Cioni did not take Nancy Guthrie. The official investigation confirmed that. A polygraph confirmed that. A retired FBI special agent confirmed that. The Pima County Sheriff confirmed that, publicly, on the record. And yet, for weeks, hundreds of thousands of people across social media, YouTube, and true crime forums built an entire case against him. A case built not on evidence, but on proximity, appearance, and the specific social psychology of how the internet decides someone looks guilty. That is what this video is about. Not whether Tommaso Cioni is involved in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. He isn't, according to every piece of official information available. This is about how a man who taught biology to high school students in Tucson, who plays bass in a local band, who writes poetry, who makes homemade pasta on weekends, how a man with that life became the internet's prime suspect in a kidnapping he had nothing to do with, and why understanding how that happened matters for every missing persons case that follows this one. To understand what happened to Tommaso Cioni, you need to understand who he is and what his connection to Nancy was. Cioni was born in San Giovanni Valdarno, a small city in Tuscany, Italy. He came to Tucson in 2006, the same year he married Annie Guthrie, Savannah's older sister. He has lived there ever since. He teaches biology at Basis Oro Valley School. He is, by every account, deeply embedded in the fabric of a specific Tucson life, local, grounded, unhurried. He and Annie have a son together. Their social media showed what appeared to be a genuinely happy life. Hikes in the Arizona desert, family trips to Italy, the kind of ordinary, joyful documentation that millions of people share without thinking twice about who might be watching. His relationship with Nancy Guthrie, by all accounts, was warm. She was his mother-in-law. He was part of the family. And on the night of January 31st, 2026, he drove her home from dinner and made sure she was safely inside her house before leaving. That is the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie alive. Cioni drove away. And whatever happened next happened after he was gone. If you've been following the Nancy Guthrie investigation and you want every development covered the moment it breaks, including what the DNA evidence is actually showing and what investigators know that they haven't said publicly, make sure you're subscribed to the Obscure Report. This case is moving and you don't want to miss what's coming. The timeline of January 31st matters because it establishes exactly what Cioni's connection to the disappearance actually is. He was the last person to confirm Nancy was home and safe. That's his role. The sheriff's office publicly confirmed this, that Cioni dropped Nancy off at approximately 9:50 p.m. and that she was safely inside before he left. At some point, between that moment and the following morning, something happened. And when Nancy was reported missing on February 1st, investigators began the standard process of interviewing everyone connected to her, including the last person known to have seen her. That's not suspicion. That's investigative procedure. You always start with the last known contact. Cioni, according to reporting, cooperated fully and immediately. He submitted to a polygraph examination. He passed it. The FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Office interviewed him, and on February 16th, Just 16 days after Nancy was reported missing, Sheriff Chris Nanos issued a clear and unambiguous statement. To be clear, Nanos said, the Guthrie family, to include all siblings and spouses, has been cleared as possible suspects in this case. That's not a partial exoneration. That's not a conditional clearance. That's a formal law enforcement statement that Tommaso Cioni, Annie Guthrie, and the rest of the family are not suspects. The case was moving in a different direction entirely, but the internet had already decided otherwise. And here's what I want you to understand about how that decision got made. It wasn't based on anything investigators had found. It was based on a pattern of reasoning that, when you lay it out step by step, is more disturbing than the accusations themselves. Cioni was the last person to see Nancy. Therefore, he must know something. He's Italian, foreign-born, with an accent, with a background that some online commenters clearly found unfamiliar and therefore suspicious. He lives in the same area of Tucson as Nancy. And then, critically, the FBI released images of the porch guy, the masked and armed individual captured on Nancy's doorbell camera on the morning of her disappearance. And a significant portion of the online true crime community decided that the porch guy looked like Tommaso Cioni. Let me be precise about what that comparison was based on. The porch guy is masked. He is described as approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall and was carrying a 25-liter backpack. That is what investigators publicly described. There is no face visible. There is no identifying feature beyond height, build, and general body language. And from that, from a masked figure of average male height in a backpack, hundreds of thousands of people decided they recognized Tommaso Cioni, not because of evidence, because of a shape, because of a posture, because of what retired FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer described precisely and publicly as appearance-based assumptions. Coffindaffer was direct when she addressed the accusations. She stated that there is no physical corroboration when you look at the porch guy's visible mannerisms, his walk, his frame, and compare them to Tommaso Cioni. There's nothing there to compare, she said. She wasn't being diplomatic. She was making a forensic statement. The comparison that the internet was running with had no evidentiary basis whatsoever. The features that would allow you to make that identification, face, gait pattern, distinctive physical markers, were either concealed or absent. What remained was essentially a height estimate applied to a man who appeared to be of average height. And if you want to follow every piece of this investigation as it develops, the DNA, the porch guy, the full forensic picture, subscribe. I post every update as it breaks. This is where the Ashley Banfield dimension of this story becomes important, because what happened online didn't stay online. Banfield, the television journalist whose coverage of the Nancy Guthrie case had a significant audience, made claims on her program that specifically linked Cioni to the investigation in a way that went significantly further than what official sources had said. The specifics of what was said have been reported on by multiple outlets. What is documented is the fallout. Savannah Guthrie, according to reporting from multiple sources, was described as livid, not upset. Livid. Megyn Kelly, on her Sirius XM program, addressed it directly. She confirmed that Savannah was furious about the reports and definitely does not suspect her brother-in-law. An insider told outlets that Savannah felt completely blindsided and that she believed a specific line between reporting and causing harm had been crossed. Whether there would be any legal action was discussed publicly, notably by Megyn Kelly, who brought attorneys onto her program to analyze whether a defamation claim would be viable. The consensus among the legal commentators she consulted was that the threshold for defamation of a private individual is substantially lower than for a public figure, and that Chioni, as a private citizen, would have a stronger potential claim than a public figure would in the same situation. Whether any action was ultimately pursued is not confirmed in the public record. What is confirmed is that the accusations were serious enough and their impact severe enough that the possibility of legal recourse was being genuinely evaluated. And that takes us to one of the details that most clearly illustrates how serious this situation became for the Sioni family. The Pima County Sheriff's Department increased police patrols near Tommaso and Annie Guthrie's home, not because investigators suspected Sioni of anything, but because the volume and intensity of online threats directed at the family had reached a level that required a physical law enforcement response. An innocent man, a cleared man, needed police protection outside his house because the internet had decided he was guilty. Let that land. I also want to be specific about what Annie Guthrie was going through in parallel to all of this. Annie is Savannah's older sister. She is Nancy's daughter. Her mother was missing. She was living through a nightmare. The specific kind of nightmare where you don't know if the person you love is dead or alive, and you don't know when or if you're going to get an answer. And while that was her reality, she was simultaneously watching her husband be named publicly as a possible suspect in her own mother's disappearance. The cruelty of that layering, the grief about her mother colliding with the injustice of what was being done to the man she chose to spend her life with, is not something that gets discussed seriously in most coverage of this case. It tends to get subsumed into the larger narrative about the investigation. But Annie is a real person, in a real marriage, raising a real child, and the online mob that targeted her husband was causing harm to her at the precise moment when she had the least capacity to absorb it. Annie Guthrie and Sioni publicly addressed the situation, reportedly sending what was described as a warning to online accusers. The specifics of what they said have not been fully reported, but the fact that they had to say anything, that a biology teacher and his wife had to publicly address the threat level their family was facing because of internet accusations in a case where law enforcement had explicitly cleared them, is one of the more disturbing subplots in a case that has no shortage of disturbing elements. Now, I want to think through carefully the three dynamics that produced this outcome. Because what happened to Tommaso Cioni didn't happen randomly. It happened through a specific sequence of steps, and understanding those steps is the only way to understand how to prevent the same thing from happening to the next innocent person in the next high-profile case. The first dynamic is what I would call the proximity trap. When a person goes missing, the people closest to them become, by definition, the most relevant subjects of early investigative attention. This is correct investigative procedure. The people who had the most access to the victim are the first people investigators need to understand and account for. But in the court of public opinion, early investigative attention gets translated into something it isn't: early investigative suspicion. The fact that investigators talked to Sioni, which they were obligated to do as the last known contact, became, in online narratives, evidence that investigators suspected him. It didn't mean that. It never meant that. But the proximity trap had already closed. The second dynamic is the identification problem. The porch guy video gave the internet something to work with: a figure, a silhouette, a height estimate. And once the online community had decided Shioni was the person to look at, they began fitting every available piece of visual information to that conclusion, rather than examining the visual information and letting it lead where it actually went. This is confirmation bias operating at scale. You decide first, then you find the evidence that supports the decision. Coffindaffer's rebuke of this process was exactly right. Comparisons based on limited footage of a masked individual applied to a specific named person don't produce identification. They produce the appearance of identification, which is meaningfully different and significantly more dangerous. Before we get to the third dynamic, I want to dwell on the specific ecosystem that made what happened to Shioni possible, because it's worth understanding in detail. The YouTube true crime community has built an investigative infrastructure of sorts. Channels with hundreds of thousands of subscribers that post daily updates on active cases, that break down footage frame by frame, that compile timelines, that do what they describe as their own independent research. Some of that work is genuinely useful. Crowdsourced attention has, in documented cases, produced real tips that real investigators followed up on, and that led to real results. The problem is that the same infrastructure that occasionally surfaces a useful lead operates without the safeguards that professional investigators have built into their process. There's no requirement to verify before publishing. There's no liability for naming someone incorrectly. There's no mechanism for formally retracting a theory when it's proven wrong. Videos stay up. Comments stay active. The algorithm keeps recommending the content to new viewers even after the named person has been officially cleared. Shioni was officially cleared on February 16th. Weeks later, videos naming him were still circulating and still generating new views and new comments from people encountering the theory for the first time. The clearing didn't propagate the way the accusation did. Clearings never do. That asymmetry is structural, and it's not going to fix itself. The third dynamic is the amplification problem, and it's the one that the Banfield situation most clearly represents. Online speculation about Shioni existed before any media figure amplified it, but it remained relatively contained as long as it stayed in comment sections and YouTube theories. When a credentialed journalist with a significant platform addressed those theories in a way that gave them additional weight, even implicitly, the speculation crossed a threshold. It moved from the unverified corners of the internet into the category of things that a reasonable person might assume had some basis in reporting. That crossover is where the reputational damage becomes most severe and most difficult to undo, and it's where the legal analysis that Megyn Kelly's attorneys conducted becomes relevant. Private citizens have recourse when that crossover happens in ways that public figures don't, because the standard for proving harm is different. There is a documented history of exactly this pattern in high-profile missing persons cases, and it's worth naming because it establishes that what happened to Shioni was not a one-time anomaly. It was the same playbook that played out in the John Benet Ramsey investigation, in the Madeleine McCann case, in the cases of Scott Peterson's family members who weren't Scott Peterson. Whenever a victim has a connection to someone foreign-born, someone who doesn't fit a specific visual profile of what innocent is supposed to look like, someone who came into the family through marriage rather than birth, that person gets extra scrutiny from the crowd. It's not random who the internet targets. There are patterns, and examining those patterns honestly requires acknowledging that appearance, nationality, and cultural background play a role in who gets accused online, even when the official investigation has found no basis for it. Sioni is Italian. He has an accent. He has a name that sounds different. I'm not saying that's the only reason the internet went after him, but I'm not pretending it wasn't a factor either. Now, here's the thing about this case that I think most coverage has missed, and it connects to the actual investigation. Every hour that the internet spent constructing and disseminating its case against Tommaso Cioni was an hour the public's attention was pointed away from the porch guy, the actual named suspect in this investigation. The FBI released those images with a specific purpose. They wanted the public's help identifying an armed, masked man who appeared at Nancy's door on the morning of her disappearance. That is the person investigators believe is connected to what happened to Nancy. Not a cleared family member. A masked figure on a doorbell camera who came to her house apparently knew the layout of the property and whose identity remains unknown as of this reporting. The DNA analysis currently underway is focused on physical material recovered from the scene. A genetic genealogist involved in the investigation described hair fibers recovered from the scene as potentially significant. Hair without roots can, in certain circumstances, yield mitochondrial DNA that can be compared against databases and, in combination with genetic genealogy techniques, potentially identify a contributor even without a direct database match. This is the same general methodology that solved the Golden State Killer case, building a family tree from a partial DNA match, then narrowing down to a specific individual. The process is time-consuming, which is why the sheriff told a neighborhood watch group it could take 6 more months. But the target of that analysis is the porch guy, not Tommaso Cioni. The new footage that reportedly showed an intruder's familiarity with the home layout brought Cioni's name back into some online commentary briefly, with some suggesting that only someone who had visited the home would know how to navigate it efficiently. But this reasoning contains a significant flaw. The Guthrie family are not strangers to Tucson. Nancy's home had been the site of family gatherings over years. The number of people with some familiarity with that home's layout is not limited to immediate family. And more importantly, an intruder with criminal intent planning an abduction might survey a property specifically to learn its layout in advance of the event. Familiarity with a layout is not evidence of prior residency or family connection. It's evidence of prior attention to the property, which the porch guy clearly had, given that he appeared to know where to stand and how to approach. Where does this case stand today? Tommaso Cioni is not a suspect. He was cleared by law enforcement on February 16th. He passed a polygraph examination. A retired FBI agent with specific expertise in behavioral analysis reviewed the porch guy footage and the claims against Cioni and found no evidentiary basis for the comparison. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has increased patrols near the Cioni family's home to protect them from the online mob. The real investigation is focused on physical DNA evidence and the identity of the porch guy. No arrest has been made. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. The investigation is ongoing, and here is what I want to sit with you for a moment before I ask you my question. Tommaso Cioni did not ask to be in this case. He did what any person would do for their mother-in-law. He drove her home, made sure she was safe, and went back to his own life. His reward for that ordinary act of care was weeks of online harassment, threats serious enough to require police protection, and the amplification of accusations against him by journalists with audiences in the hundreds of thousands. He has a son, he has a wife, Savannah Guthrie's sister, who is going through the disappearance of her own mother while simultaneously watching her husband be accused online of causing it. The human cost of what happened to this family, layered on top of everything they were already experiencing, is something that true crime coverage doesn't often account for. I'm accounting for it here, because it matters. Here is what I want to ask you directly, and I want your honest answer in the comments. We've covered everything: the official clearance, the polygraph, the FBI agent's rebuttal, the media amplification, the police protection. Knowing all of that, do you think what happened to Tommaso Cioni was an inevitable product of how true crime communities function online, where proximity and appearance become probable cause in the absence of official answers? Or do you think there was something specific about this case, the victim's connection to a famous daughter, the Italian background, the media environment, that made Cioni a particular kind of target? And if it's inevitable, what does that mean for the next cleared family member in the next high-profile case? Because there will be one. There always is. Tell me what you think in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe to the Obscure Report. We cover this investigation with the depth it deserves, and we cover it accurately, which means we follow the evidence, not the crowd. The next video in this series is going to examine the DNA timeline in detail, what a 6-month analysis actually tells us about where the investigation is, and whether the porch guy identification is closer than law enforcement is saying publicly.